Fish on Fridays. I'm Al McCauley, and today I want to do another episode where I look at a piece of famous art and kind of unpack it for you, give it some context, and just to help us better appreciate the treasure that is Catholic art. I've done many episodes on different pieces of art. I think this is the first one I've ever done on a sculpture, though. Usually they're just on paintings, and this one is a fantastic and a very iconic, well-known piece of art by a Baroque artist named Bernini, and it was completed about the year 1652. It's called The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Now, there's a lot that I need to backpedal a little bit and just give you context of what's going on in this very dramatic sculpture. I mean, first of all, you just look at it and there's a lot going on. And so let's take a look at it. First of all, let's briefly recount who Saint Teresa was. Saint Teresa of Avila was a 16th century founder and kind of reformer of the Carmelite order. In fact, it became known as the Order of Carmelites Descalced because of her efforts to reform that order. Descalced is a word that means without shoes. And if you notice in this piece of art that St. Teresa is not wearing shoes. Now, just as context, we understand that Carmelites don't walk around barefoot all the time necessarily. It's a symbolic gesture of simplicity and humility, the type of lifestyle that they'll embrace in their vocation. Nonetheless, Saint Teresa was a powerhouse. She was a wonderful, dynamic founder of the Carmelite orders, and she really did a lot to reform the monastery system throughout Europe in the wake of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation from the early 1500s. It started by Martin Luther, continued by John Calvin and Henry VIII and others. So she was one of the real pivotal movers and shakers that really reasserted the Catholic Church, really reclaimed its authority and and getting us back to what we really should be about, along with things like the Council of Trent and the founding of the Jesuit order by Ignatius of Loyola. Teresa of Avila was one of those powerhouses. She's what we call a doctor of the church. She wrote prolifically, and for a woman in the 16th century, that was pretty amazing. A doctor of the church, I've chronicled this in past episodes. They're those saints in the Catholic tradition who have written about and taught something that is universally understood, and it'll be around forever. She's a preeminent teacher of the faith. And just in context of the thousands of saints we have in our tradition, only 37 men and women have been recognized as doctors, and she's one of them. So gives you an idea of what a powerhouse she is, powerhouse that she was, I should say. This particular piece of art is made during what we call the Baroque period, and it's a very much pro-Catholic kind of a period. It's trying to get us back to understanding our roots and what's important. And so this piece comes from a moment in Teresa's autobiography, her Vita, her life, that she wrote about something that we call today an ecstasy event. And she was a mystic. Okay, that's the way we'd put it. She was a mystic. She had visions. She would levitate in prayer, where she would float off the ground, because she was in such deep communion with our Lord that she would have these just spectacular, phenomenal experiences. And the word ecstasy comes from two Latin words, ecstasis. It literally means being taken outside of oneself. And that's what happened. She would levitate. She would have these moments. And she wrote about them in her autobiography. And many people were witness to these events, by the way. So it's not like she was just making this up. But one in particular was so and it still is so intriguing and provocative that this moment, I'm going to read it a little bit to you, a few sentences of it, just to give you an idea of what Bernini is trying to capture in this piece of art. So I'm going to go off screen to read this, but it's really important to listen to it, not necessarily with our current, I should say, sensibilities and mentality, but what somebody in the 16th century might have meant by this. So here we go. She describes an angel who has a flaming arrow, and this is what she said. He thrust it into my heart many times, and it pierced my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me on fire with the great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this exquisite pain that I could not wish to get rid of it. The soul is satisfied now with nothing less than God. The pain is not bodily, but spiritual, although the body does have a share in it. Now, that's a long way of describing what Bernini is trying to capture here. She had this experience of an angel who literally left her on fire with the love of God. And so you see in this sculpture, the angel is very daintily pulling back her gown, and he's got a sword, or a spear, I should say, in his right hand, ready to pierce her. And if you look at her hands and her feet, they're limp. They're just lifeless. She's just taken up in this rapture of sorts in this event. Notice how the sculpture, which is very heavy, it's made out of marble, but notice how it has its appearance is almost like it's off the ground. It's very ethereal, like it's light. It's happening. She's resting on a cloud, and she's just kind of kicking back, if you will. And her eyes are fluttering almost in this event. Now, a lot of people will falsely claim that this is pseudo-erotic. And that's why I said, don't listen to these words and don't look at this piece of art with our common or our current sensibilities. Unfortunately, in our time, I think the idea of a sexual union has been very much downplayed and relegated to just the physical. And Teresa is trying to explain the unexplainable in her autobiography. She has these ecstasy experiences, and how do you explain them to somebody like you and I who don't have them? And so what she did was she used the idea of married love as the expression of deep sense of the other and surrender to the other. And when you look at this, what do you see? You see Saint Teresa completely surrendering. It's a self-surrender to God's love. And that's really what we're called to do. Obviously, you and I aren't probably going to have these kind of ecstasy experiences, but if we surrender to God's love, then we can become better agents of that love in our own little corners of the world. And that's really what it's about. But she's trying to use this human language as an analogy to get us to understand how deep this love she felt for God. The example I would use, or the metaphor I would use to get this across is, as a man, I'm never going to have a baby. My wife and I have 3 children, and I remember when she was pregnant with each of them asking, how did it feel? Well, she would have to use metaphors. She would say that, the contractions are like a Charlie horse, or when your muscle tightens and then lets go. I've experienced those, so I can kind of get a sense of what she's talking about, but I'll never experience the fullness of what it means to carry a baby and give birth. In the same way, Teresa knew we are never going to be able to experience, most of us, this unbelievable experience of God's presence and our self-surrender to it. And so she used the best human analogy she could in order to help us to understand. That's very important to understand when you think of this picture, this sculpture, when you look at this image. One last thing I want to say that I think is fascinating is Bernini wanted to give a shout out to somebody who he really admired and someone who you all know, and that's Michelangelo. Michelangelo was a good century and a half before him. But if you look at the Pietà, which is the very iconic and famous painting of Mary holding the body of Jesus as he's taken down from the cross, you notice in Jesus's face that same sort of self-surrender, that same idea of I'm giving myself over to God's love. And that's what you see, the expression you see on Teresa's face in this work by Bernini, this idea of, again, self-surrender to God's love. Difficult to do, but something that we're all called to do in our own ways. Obviously, we're not called, all of us are not called to have ecstasy experiences, but we are called to surrender to God's will to the extent that we can in our situation. A beautiful piece of art, something great to reflect on, to think about, and to think about God's love and how we maybe take it for granted. And we need to be on fire with God's love and look for those little experiences, those relationships that will always bring us back to Him and give us that fire and that love of God so that we can live it out in our lives. A lot there. Hope this was helpful. Oh, by the way, St. Teresa's of Avila's feast day is October 15th. Anybody, if you know anybody named Teresa or born on October 15th, you might want to share this with them, or if they have a love of art. But appreciate you watching every Friday for Fish on Fridays. We'd love it if you'd subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook. But until next time, please be good to each other, and God bless.